Hi everyone, it's Peter. Today I'm standing in front of our small display of artifacts from the very earliest days of the telephone, and Sarah is still back there behind the camera. I wanted to show you these because this Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2026, is a major anniversary for telephone history fans. 150 years ago, on that day in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell filed for what has been called the single most valuable patent in the history of technology. You might have heard about the race to the patent office between Bell and Elijah Gray that day. It's an often repeated tale, and it usually comes with some kind of moral about being early instead of late. Historians, both amateur and professional, still write and argue about exactly what happened back then, which to me is just a great indication of how significant whatever happened then turned out to be. But is it really true that if Elijah Gray had just gotten up a little earlier that morning, the world would now credit him as the inventor of the telephone instead of Bell? That's what we'll talk about today. There's no shortage of historical documentation from and about Alexander Graham Bell. He was a pack rat who kept every notebook, letter, scribble, receipt, and scrap of paper, and his relatives kept the letters he wrote to them too. By the time he died in 1922, he was famous enough that all of his papers were carefully preserved, and I was able to indulge in some reading. Now, in 1874, Bell was a professor at Boston University who also tutored a few deaf students on the side. In October that year, Bell was invited to a tea party at the home of Mabel Hubbard, one of those students. Gardner Green Hubbard, Mabel's dad, was one of the Boston Brahmins. In other words, he was well off, well connected, and influential. Bell sat down at Hubbard's grand piano to play a few tunes, and then he showed Gardner his favorite party trick. Bell would press the sustain pedal and then sing a loud note into the top of the piano. When he stopped singing, they could hear the piano still sounding the note. Museum volunteer Max has managed to recreate the trick for us here. Let's do a quick review of the basic physics, and my apologies if you already know all of this. Here I have three strings, A, B, and C. A and B are identical, but C is thicker and heavier. Now imagine I have an oscilloscope sort of thing connected to the three strings. When I pluck A, it begins to vibrate at its fundamental frequency, and it sounds a note. Because B is identical to A, it responds to the sound waves coming through the air and begins to vibrate too. It resonates, to use the proper term. But C does not vibrate since the note it plays, its own fundamental frequency, is different. If I damp string A so it stops vibrating, B will continue to sound the note. Of course, I can pluck C as well, but doing that has no influence on A or B since it plays a different note. You might ask, why am I making such a big deal about this? Here's a telegraph key and a sounder from those days, and it can only transmit one message at a time using the clickety-clack of Morse code. One of Bell's many ideas was that by using different notes, you might transmit multiple telegraph signals at once over just one line. A message from telegrapher number 1 could be transmitted using the note A3, for example, and a simultaneous message from telegrapher number 2 could be transmitted using the note E4. At the other end, some kind of resonant device would separate out the messages by note and send each one to a different recipient. In other words, way back in 1874, Bell was already thinking about a frequency division carrier system, though he called it a harmonic telegraph. Carrier systems eventually turned out to be a super useful idea because they do exactly what Bell had in mind. They allow us to squeeze many conversations onto a single physical circuit. We have a few generations of different carrier on display here at the museum, like this N carrier setup, or some L carrier. By the 1870s, telegraphy had become a hugely profitable business, which was dominated in the United States by Western Union. Bell's little performance was music to Gardner Hubbard's ears, both literally and figuratively. What Bell did not know is that Hubbard was having a bit of a feud with William Orton, the president of Western Union Company. Hubbard tried to get Congress to pass a bill to nationalize the telegraph system and make it part of the post office. The bill didn't pass, but Hubbard was not ready to give up on cutting Orton down by a notch or two if he could. So Hubbard immediately realized that Bell's idea would drastically reduce the cost of running a telegraph network, since installing and maintaining the lines was a huge part of the expense. If you could use the wires more efficiently, then you could build a competing network and undercut Western Union on price. Or else perhaps you could make them license a patent from you at some substantial royalty. So Hubbard, together with Thomas Sanders, who was also the father of one of Bell's students, agreed to fund a research and development effort for Bell to pursue the idea. Bell was a tinkerer and an intuitive inventor, but he was not someone with the mechanical or electrical skills he needed to turn his idea into a working prototype. So with funding in hand, he took leave from the university and went to the shop of Charles Williams, who was a maker of electrical instruments in Boston, to have some prototype devices constructed. Bell's commission was assigned to a young machinist at the Williams shop named Thomas Watson. Bell got along so well with Watson that before long Bell hired him away from Williams to work on the harmonic telegraph project full-time. These artifacts from the museum collection are reproductions of some of the things that Watson constructed for Bell back in those days. An initial set of reproductions were made by the Williams shop for the Centennial Exposition of 1876 in Philadelphia, and those are in the Smithsonian today. But because many Bell System phone companies eventually wanted to show them off too, more reproductions were made by Bell Labs starting in the 1920s, and they were placed in display cases in building lobbies or shown whenever a Bell System company went to an exhibit or a fair. Some of these are entirely non-functional and useful for display only. But this one here actually works, which is neat because this particular device is super important to the patent I'm talking about today. It's an electromagnet with a thin strip of steel on top here. If you apply an alternating electrical signal to the coil, the strip vibrates in response to the changing magnetic field. And if you provide that signal at the fundamental frequency of the strip, which in this case is about 45 Hertz, it will vibrate very enthusiastically. You can tune the fundamental frequency of the vibrating strip a little bit by loosening these two screws here and moving the strip back and forth. Watson also made a version of this device which added an electrical contact that opened and closed at the top of the strip as it moved up and down. So basically it was a buzzer when you wired it so the contact controlled the flow of electricity from a battery to the coil. I don't know if the labs ever made reproductions of that version, but we certainly don't have one. So I made one functionally like it from my boyhood electrical experiment kit. Bell experimented with a bunch of these vibrators set to run at different frequencies, each controlled by a telegrapher's key and connected together to feed one wire. At the other end, he would have devices of the other type, each tuned so that it would resonate only in response to the specific frequency of its corresponding buzzer on the transmitting end. But to make a carrier system of this type actually work, you need oscillators at the transmitting end that produce a nice pure tone with no harmonic distortion and that are also highly stable so their frequency doesn't drift with age and temperature and battery voltage. And at the receiving end, you need detectors that have very narrow bandpass filters which allow through only the signals at the frequency they are tuned to. It was not until the invention of the vacuum tube in 1907 that practical carrier systems became possible, with the first one coming out of Western Electric's research lab in 1915. After that, they produced Type B carrier and then Type C, and AT&T kept working on one improved carrier system after another for the next 50 years, giving letters to each new design, although not all of them ever made it into the field. Eventually, they got to T carrier, which is digital. There's a good chance you've heard about T1 transmission lines. But Alec Bell, as his friends called him, had neither stable oscillators nor good detectors in 1875, and there was really no hope for him to make his carrier system idea work in practice, given the technology that was available then. But he didn't know what he didn't know, and so he and Watson forged ahead. Here on my bench is one of their test setups, as best as I'm able to recreate it. Unfortunately, in his notebooks, Bell never says exactly what frequencies he was experimenting with. I don't know how Bell Labs chose 45 Hertz when they made this reproduction. It seems kind of low to me. But that's the device I have, so I tuned my buzzer to run at that frequency too. Now it does work, at least to the degree that when I apply battery to my buzzer, it starts making a signal, and then when I connect the receiver to it, the receiver vibrates in response, as you can see. But if we look at that signal on the oscilloscope, it is far from being a nice clean sine wave. Bell would certainly have killed to have had an oscilloscope in his lab in 1875. It would have helped him a lot to understand what was going on. Bell did live to see oscilloscopes invented, but they were still at least 20 years into the future when he and Watson were doing all of this. If I connect the model receiver to a signal generator instead of to the buzzer, we see that it responds to a broad range around 45 Hz, and unsurprisingly, it also vibrates at around 22 Hz, and at 90 or half and double the fundamental. So its adjacent frequency rejection, to use the technical term, is pretty poor. That problem must have caused Bell a lot of frustration, and it's clear to me that Bell and Watson did not have a good theoretical grasp of what was going on. But they forged ahead, tweaking this and trying that in their lab in the attic over the Charles Williams shop, hoping to make something work. All the while, Bell's investors, Hubbard in particular, were pushing him hard to hurry up and produce a patent application. What Bell eventually discovered by accident, and what got him quite excited, was that if you simply pluck the strip on one of these receivers, it produces an electrical signal that is much closer to a sine wave than the noisy harmonic-filled signal that was made by the buzzer. Bell could hear a clean tone on another receiver connected to the plucked one. Let's look at that on the oscilloscope. When I pluck the strip, I get a pretty nice sine wave at 90 Hz, or twice the fundamental. The battery here just serves to create a constant magnetic field for the strip to vibrate in. Later, Watson figured out that you could use a permanent magnet and no battery at all. Bell decided that this was enough to go on and that he was ready at last to draft a patent application. In it, he was a bit hand-wavy about what exactly was supposed to keep the metal strips on the transmitting side vibrating. Perhaps a nice breeze, he suggested. By this point in the video, you might be wondering, is Peter ever going to talk about the telephone patent? Yes, I will tell you about that, but all of this telegraphy stuff is what that first ever telephone patent was actually supposed to be about. You see, Bell was clearly someone who struggles to focus on one thing and finish it before starting on another. I'm completely sympathetic to him on that, and I suspect that many of you viewers of our YouTube channel must somehow deal with having that same kind of brain too. So Bell had this other idea kicking around. Wouldn't it be cool if you could figure out some way to send a human voice over the wires instead of just sending Morse code? Now, Bell was clearly not the first person to think of that. A German scientist named Philipp Reis demonstrated a device that he named a telephone way back in 1861. I think Reis should at least get credit for inventing the name. His device was described in an English language journal in 1869, but it doesn't seem like Bell knew about it. There was also an Italian-American inventor named Antonio Meucci, who described his idea for a telephone in a caveat in 1879. We will get to what a caveat is in a minute. The problem with both of these earlier inventors is that while the idea was there, they never made anything that actually worked. Reis's device would let you sing a song into the transmitter, and then someone at the receiving end might be able to pick out the tune. But it did not transmit understandable speech. And in the case of Meucci, it's pretty hard to believe, from looking at his drawing, that it ever did anything at all. His description did not include any explanation of how it was supposed to work, but for some reason you had to sit on a chair that was mounted on glass insulators in order to use it. Neither of those folks kept working to improve their device to the point of making it useful, and neither of them applied for a full patent. So back to Bell. In addition to what Hubbard and Sanders wanted him to work on, he was thinking about voice transmission. For short distances, there were speaking tubes, which they used on ships and sometimes in wealthy people's houses, and those were clearly useful. There was also the classic tin cannon string toy, which was being sold as a novelty item even back then. It may be hard to imagine, given what we know today, but in 1876, almost no one besides Bell could think of any reason why you might want to talk to someone else who is really far away using some kind of technological device. That lack of enthusiasm for the very idea of the telephone is really important, and I think an underappreciated part of this story. By December of 1875, Bell finally had a draft patent application ready for his harmonic telegraph. Now, patent law had just changed. Until shortly before then, to patent a device in the United States, you had to provide a physical model of your invention to the patent office. But in 1870, the rules changed and the requirement for a model was dropped, mainly because the patent office was running out of room to store them all. So you could apply for a patent with a mere written description of your invention. In principle, that description was and still is, supposed to provide sufficient detail that someone skilled in the relevant art could reproduce your device. But since he did not have to provide a working model, it meant that Bell could apply for a patent for his harmonic telegraph without being sure that the thing really worked, which, as it turns out, it would not have. The patent's title is Improvement in Telegraphy. The most famous and foundational of the many, many patents on telephony does not actually contain the word telephone in it at all. In fact, it just barely mentions the idea of voice transmission, sort of in passing when he wrote, "I desire here to remark that there are many other uses to which these instruments may be put." The draft had been written out neatly, probably by a copyist who was hired to do that. Then Bell, who was at the Hubbard's house babysitting Mabel on the night of January 12, 1876, sat down in their library to review the copy and spontaneously decided to scribble in a few extra sentences in the margin. He added his idea for a microphone to a patent that was fundamentally on telegraphy and stuck in a claim about transmitting vocal or other sounds. The original patent specification is preserved at the Smithsonian. You can see that the additions are in a different handwriting. These last-minute tweaks eventually became quite controversial, but they did not really worry anyone at the time. Finally, we come to that fateful Valentine's Day in 1876. Bell had signed the application and sent it to the patent lawyers in Washington, D.C., but for reasons having to do with British patent law, he asked them not to submit it there until he got confirmation that it had been filed in London, where another acquaintance of his was supposed to deliver it. But Hubbard was running out of patience and told the attorneys to go ahead and file Bell's application in the U.S. Patent Office on February 14th. Did Hubbard hurry things up because he had some sort of clue that Elijah Gray was about to file something too? Maybe. Gray was one of the founders of Western Electric, then a major manufacturer of telegraphy equipment, and which ultimately became the main supplier to the Bell system. Gray was also a prolific inventor and patenter, and he and Bell had butted heads in the patent office before. Hubbard knew that Gray had come to D.C. from Chicago, and it's at least possible that Hubbard had a contact in Gray's patent lawyer's office who whispered something into his ear. We don't know for sure, and I'm afraid this is not something we will ever know for sure. In any case, at Hubbard's instruction, the lawyers delivered Bell's papers to the patent office sometime in the morning of February 14th. Later that day, Elijah Gray's lawyers arrived with a document from him called a caveat. Now, to really understand how much this timing mattered, we have to dive into the minutiae of 1870s patent law even a little more. Until recently, the United States used a system called first to invent. This means that it did not really matter when you filed your patent application. What mattered for priority over other inventors was the day you actually invented the device, which you could try to show through your lab notebooks or through correspondence or with testimony from other people who saw you do it. Before 1909, you could also give the patent office a document called a caveat, which just gave a brief description of your invention but fell short of a full application. The caveat basically put the patent office on notice that you were going to file an application soon. So if some other inventor came along with a similar thing after your caveat was filed, the patent office would have to conduct what they called an interference proceeding to try to figure out who really invented the thing first. Most other countries used a first-to-file system where patent priority was simply granted to the first person to get their application in. The United States finally switched to first-to-file in 2013. Let's look at what Gray submitted that day. Here's the drawing from his original caveat. The most important part is the box that the person on the right is speaking into. Gray wrote, "The person transmitting sounds is shown as talking into a box, across the outer end of which is stretched a diaphragm. Attached to this diaphragm is a light metal rod which extends into a vessel made of glass, through which passes another conductor forming part of the circuit. This vessel is filled with some liquid possessing high resistance, such as, for instance, water." It was generally known then, and certainly known to both Gray and Bell, that you could make a variable resistor with a conductive rod that you moved up and down in a container of water. So Gray's new idea was to use a diaphragm vibrated by someone's voice to move the rod up and down. Bell's last-minute addition to his patent describes his version of the idea like this. Let mercury or some other liquid form part of the circuit. Then, the more deeply the conducting wire is immersed in the mercury or other liquid, the less resistance does the liquid offer to the passage of current. Hence, the vibration of the conducting wire in mercury or other liquid included in the circuit causes undulations in the current. In his patent's last paragraph, Bell added that he was claiming the method and apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically. So Gray and Bell had roughly the same idea around the same time. I think it's relevant to note here that this idea was actually not a very good one in any case. It does not seem like Gray ever tried to really build such a device, but if he had, he would have found that it worked poorly, if at all. In Gray's version, the rod is immersed deeply in the liquid, so the amount of change to the resistance caused by its up and down motion would be tiny compared to the total, so the signal would be very weak. Bell also had not yet tried to make the thing he described. Because Gray and Bell both claimed a way of transmitting vocal sounds telegraphically, the examiner set out to begin the interference proceedings. But Hubbard had his lawyers argue that the receptionist logbooks in the patent office showed that Bell's full application had arrived a few hours before Gray's caveat, so an interference proceeding was not required, since the rule was that the caveat had to come in first. That little dispute went all the way up to the director of the patent office, who decided it in Bell's favor. Not that that meant game over for Elijah Gray. It just meant that Gray had 30 days to finish writing up the complete application and submitting it, at which point the interference proceeding would still have been carried out. But on the advice of his own lawyers, Gray decided not to do that because, as I said before, almost everyone knew that there was no commercial value to the idea of a telephone anyway. Gray's lawyers told him that it would just be a waste of time and effort, and Gray went on to work on different things. Years later, he regretted that choice. This left the examiner free to rule on Bell's application, which he did in absolute record time, granting the patent on March 7th of 1876. That seems somewhat suspicious to me. Then as now, the patent office normally took much longer to review and rule on applications. An 1875 application that Bell made for a fax machine, which also didn't work by the way, took more than a year to be approved. Today you can expect it to take 18 months to 3 years. With the patent filed, Bell went back to his lab and finally tried to build a version of the microphone that he had just described. He got it to work well enough so that Thomas Watson could hear that famous first sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." But after that success, Bell quickly moved on to other and better designs. The liquid transmitter, as it's called, was a dead end, no matter who you think invented it first. So even though the story about Bell and Gray's race to the patent office has become a bit of a meme, I think what really mattered in 1876 was not so much who handed in their papers first, but the fact that Gray chose not to make a big deal of it afterward. He could have, but he didn't, at least not then. Gray even wrote a conciliatory letter to Bell in 1877, saying, "I give you full credit for the talking feature of the telephone." My conclusion is that both Gray and Bell did file something in the patent office the same day in 1876. That was probably just a coincidence, but it's hard to know for sure. Then Bell kept working on his telephone idea, and Gray did not, which is what actually ended up being decisive. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. As other content creators say, it helps us if you comment, like, and subscribe. I know this one has been a long video, and even then I've only covered one small part of a battle that stretched out over the next 12 years and finally ended up in the Supreme Court in 1888. There was another major milestone event on March 10, 1876, and I have a video on that in the works too. And Sarah finally has another video planned, so you can look forward to that as well. Also, thank you for all of the feedback on part 1 of the electronic switching systems video. Don't worry, part 2 of that will be ready soon too, but for obvious reasons, I really wanted to put this one out by February 14th. See you all next time.